Christian apologists will never cease to amaze me how they can just tap dance and do the boogaloogie. This guy here, Charles Welch, Trivial Man, talks about the contradiction in Genesis 1:3 versus later verses in Genesis 1:3 through 5. On the first day, God created light and separated the light from darkness. However, later on, a few verses down, the sun, which separates night and day, wasn't created until the fourth day. So he goes and explains it. He says in Genesis 1:3, it says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And he repeats the verse, basically. But then he questions. He says in day 4, so if God didn't create the sun and moon until day 4, what was the light he created on day 1? Also, evenings and mornings are determined by the rising and setting of the sun, are they not? But if the sun was not created until the 4th day, then what determines the days before that? Yeah, we've all been asking that question for thousands of years. So he goes, the answer lies in the comparison of the Hebrew language, Genesis 1:3 with that of Genesis 1:16. In the first instance, the word for light is Owud, and that's how you pronounce it, O-W-R, which means light. In the second instance, in verses later on, it says Mower, where they add an M, M-O-W-R, which is a light repository, literally a candlestick or chandelier. Well, that doesn't really... So it's a giant chandelier or candlestick. That's a repository. Could we say it's a toilet? I'm sorry, I can't. So God created the light on day 1 and separated it from the darkness, permitting the distinction between day and night. And then he gathered the light into one place, the sun, on day 4, where it's been ever since. So 2 separate events, which of course contradict science. But he admits, he says, evenings and mornings are not really created by the rising and setting of the sun. They're created by the rotation of the earth on its axis and given areas spinning into and out path of light, blah, 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 blah. So, somebody by the name of Richard Hurst, as in, I guess you call him Dick Hertz, he says, sound like you really know the Bible, so perhaps you can clear up a few other minor problems, minors and little quotes around. Thanks. Anyway, he says, Genesis 1:11 through 12, verses 1:26. One says the trees came before Adam, but then later on in the second chapter, they came after Adam. Genesis 1:20, blah, 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 blah. Birds were created before Adam. Later on, birds were created after Adam. Genesis 1, the first chapter, animals were created before Adam. Genesis 2, animals were created after Adam. Genesis 1:26, Adam and Eve were created at the same time. Genesis 2, second chapter, Adam was created first, and then the woman sometime later. So I'll let you know if he ever responds back. I'll probably Richard, probably be kicked out of there. So, but they never cease to amaze me, man. Never. Which talks about which basically leads me into something else here. Darrell Ray wrote a book called God Virus. Excuse me a minute. Where he likened religion as a virus. It's in all of us. We all have this religious tendency, but it's how you control the virus, which will dictate your behavior, your beliefs, what have you. Those of us that have overcome the virus, well, therefore we're non-theistic, obviously. Those who let the virus take them over, on the other hand, well, we see what we've got. I was thinking about that, and I asked my wife about that because she's into medicine and alternate remedies and herbal medication, things like that. And I said, what about when like a virus mutates? What exactly is that? And she told me, she said, it's like they call a superbug. It was a virus, a superbug, where you hit a person that has a so-called superbug virus, a superbug virus, and that could be applicable for quite a few resistant viruses. So she says you'll hit it with antibiotic, and for a while the virus will be quelched, but then it'll become resistant to the antibiotic and maybe come back to full-blown force again, either in the same person or it'll spread somewhere else, whatever. I don't want to go into crazy details about viruses, but I was thinking about that, how viruses mutate and change and whatever. And Christianity's that way. I mean, how has it lasted all these years? Well, It's quite simple, really. And I know I'm generalizing, and I'm going to not go into a big esoteric thing, just a real brief thing. Basically, by the 1700s, 1800s, the philosophers, various philosophers, both theist and non-theist, totally excoriated the Christian doctrines, totally exposed them for what they were, and tore them apart. And I will talk about some of these philosophers in another video. And even the Bible was criticized, and there were biblical criticisms from the 1400s, 1500s on. I think John Mill, I mentioned him before. Bart Ehrman cites him in a couple of his books. John Mill was one that began this, and John Mill was a devout Christian. He wanted to create a Bible that was pretty close to the original manuscripts, or the original intent of the manuscripts, and he found he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He found thousands of errors and problems. So by the 1700s, 1800s, but the Bible itself, that what I just mentioned, that was kind of squelched. But the God belief, the philosophical, metaphysical type of aspects of this God belief were completely excoriated by philosophers. So what happens in the 1800s, 1870s, 1880s? The Bible fundamentalist shows up. I believe that's when he did, in the Midwestern states in America. And they began preaching the Bible as the absolute word of a God. Prior to that, it wasn't taught that way. People didn't believe it to be taken literally. But then this guy comes along and people like him and they start preaching this, and we had Bible fundamentalism. So we get into Bible fundamentalism from the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. And then around 1920, 1930, biblical critics began coming out again in force with more ammunition and more information about the Bible. So for decades, the wars started being waged about the Bible itself again. And then in the 50s and 60s and coming forward, the Bible was starting to be thrown away, and this presuppositional nonsense started. This guy Van Til, I think he was the one, the originator of it in the 1950s. It was so bad, so specious, his arguments, that the classic Christian apologists rejected the presuppositional views, but that didn't stop them from using them. So now we have this virus, this God virus, this Christian virus has mutated into what we have, a combination of presuppositionalism along with Bible quotes, which I don't know how you can mix them up. But that's what they do. They constantly mutate. They constantly change their tactics and all. And the truth isn't that way. I've said this before about the truth. The truth stands on its own. It's there. It's immutable. It's non-changing, okay? We have scientific truths. Of course, they're changing and things they're adding to it. But with a scientist, what the scientist does, she goes out to prove herself wrong. She doesn't go out to test something to prove herself right. She goes out to prove herself wrong. And then after humongous amounts of testing or what have you, she comes to her conclusions. Many times, she's proven herself right. And that's total intellectual honesty. But with these clowns, with their mutations, or like this thing in Genesis, where he explains it this way, and people are actually going to take that seriously. So that's your little wisdom for today. Thank you. Remember, may God be blessed.